We are having to go through the gross options here. I mean, even in my lineup, I'm having to start Javonte Williams. I'm having to start Austin Eckler. I'm having to start these guys I haven't started once all season. It's ugly in week 5. I'm not going to waste your time with the tier 1 players. I think we should all know, yes, you start Kyron Williams, you start Jordan Mason, you start CeeDee Lamb, you start Kamara, you start Nico, you start Chase, if you start Jefferson, if you start Derrick Henry. If you are playing in a league where one of these guys is on your bench, I'm sorry, you're not playing fantasy football. I don't know what you are doing. I'm going over to tier 2. Aaron Jones, the running back that I ranked way too low. I mean, really the past 3 weeks now. Early in the season, you were actually seeing a split backfield with Ty Chandler if you were looking at the underlying snap data. Here, you have a season high 82% of snaps for Aaron Jones. He takes over as a 3-down back in this backfield. We know the receiving role is consistent. Over the past 3 weeks, you've had 17 targets. And at the same time, this Vikings offense is so much better than projections had it being going into the year. So, I mean, yeah, I think Aaron Jones must start player every week. Breece Hall definitely going to be lowering expectations this week surrounding a really tough matchup that you have with the Minnesota Vikings. Breece Hall still coming off a 3.8 fantasy point game, so it was disgusting. I'm not saying that Breece Hall is still the tier 1 player you drafted would be, but he's still somebody in your lineup. Kenneth Walker as our next name. You had 60 Geno Smith dropbacks last week, and Kenneth Walker still had 3 rushing touchdowns off of 11 carries. Nuts. Going to play the Giants potentially with no Malik Nabers. Right now, there's a touchdown spread on this game where the Seahawks should be able to lean on the run in the second half. Our next guy will be Malik Nabers. Obviously, massive asterisk. Did not practice Wednesday. Did not practice on Thursday. So there's an outside chance Malik Nabers is not playing on Sunday. And I think we're all smart enough to realize if he is not active, he's not in your lineup. Going over to our next guy, we'll have Deebo Samuel. If you look at Deebo Samuel, have the highest implied team total in the NFL this week for the Niners offense. 28.5 points. The projections are extremely high here, what should be one of the highest scoring game environments of the entire week. So I'm very sorry. We're going to have the Niners guys extremely high, including Deebo Samuel. Going over to our next guy, we have Josh Jacobs. Obviously, Jacobs been extremely disappointing. He has not had a single game with 15 fantasy points this year. Yes, even in week 2 where he had the 32 rushing attempts for 151 rushing yards. What I care more so is about looking at the usage that you had with the games that had Jordan Love. Week 1, 73% of the snaps. Week 4, 61% of the snaps. In those games, he had 9 targets as well. So he's the 3-down back in this Green Bay Packers offense that I project to be one of the best offenses in the league. He has the receiving skill set. You have Marshawn Lloyd on the IR. You have A.J. Dillon on the IR. So Jacob's still a must-start running back and probably the best buy low candidate in fantasy football. So Joe Mixon has missed practice both Wednesday and Thursday. Joe Mixon practiced last Friday, so I was initially thinking that Joe Mixon would be a running back that was playing this week in week 5. We haven't seen him since week 2. But sadly, it looks like you may have another week with no Mixon here. And in that case, am I excited to go and play Cam Akers again like I did over the past 2 weeks? Probably not. I'd probably rather start Eckler or Javonte. We'll talk about them later on. James Cook will be our next back. James Cook, extremely disappointing this past week. Only 5.5 fantasy points. But outside of that, I mean, the man is on the season averaging about 15, 16 fantasy points per game. I mean, the role is consistent. You're seeing about 12 to 13 carries a game. On top of that, you're also seeing, about 3 to 4 targets a game and what is one of the best offenses in the league. So obviously you're always having to be worried about James Cook possibly getting vultured by Josh Allen, but still must start running back regardless. And then Jaden Reed will be our next guy. If you look at Jaden Reed, the target share this year hasn't been crazy, where he's only had 18% of the Green Bay Packers targets. But with that being said, he's clear buy low candidate last week with Jordan Love coming back in, expecting the volume to go crazy in this offense. And what has been crazy so far is Jaden Reed's efficiency. 34 yards per catch in week 1. 20 yards per catch this past week. Jaden Reed has been the most efficient wide receiver in the entire NFL. We know efficiency off a small sample is extremely difficult to project going into the future, but what will actually allow Jaden Reed to stay that elite option in fantasy football is that you have no Christian Watson this week and potentially no Romeo Doubs as well. There is no Doubs. Reed just absolutely crushes in a phenomenal matchup against the Rams. Now, dropping down to our next player, we will have James Conner here. If you look at James Conner, you had 19 points week 1, 19 points week 2, 18 points week 4. Seems really consistent. I'm actually a little bit concerned about Conner. He's my running back 1 in the Flock League. Not looking too hot if you're looking at the receiving involvement. Where the past 3 weeks, you've only had 3 targets. You're going up against the Niners this week, so you can't bank on the rushing touchdown. We really need to see some involvement as a receiver here. DK Metcalf did pop up on the injury report today with the hand injury. From what I can read, it sounds like Metcalf's going to be good to go. Obviously, Metcalf has been an absolute crusher so far this season. Where with Metcalf over the past 3 weeks, he is averaging 20 fantasy points per game. And that could have been much bigger if this past week you had an extra inch for him to actually score that touchdown. But going up against the New York Giants, I don't necessarily know if we can expect that we have 50, 60 Geno Smith dropbacks like we've seen in some of these other games. Just because obviously this is an environment where the Seahawks are touchdown favorites. I think you get a little more of a Kenneth Walker game than DK Metcalf. Chris Olave will be our next player. With Olave, if you actually look at the underdog pick'em this week, he's at 66.5 receiving yards. I want to say, oh, that's really high. If you look at other receivers, like underdog has Marvin Harrison at 54.5 receiving yards. But you look at Olave and go, well, he's had over 80 receiving yards for 3 straight weeks. Outside of week 1, where it was the absolute blow up against the Panthers, where I think it's very difficult to take too much away from that game. Ultimately, you have seen the consistency with Chris Olave. If you look at the larger sample as well, dating back over the past 2 years, I mean, Olave has been a wide receiver that has had the consistent target volume where maybe you haven't had it as much, specifically with somebody like Shahid that we'll talk about later on. Going over to Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard has back-to-back weeks here with over 20 opportunities. He's had the usage as a receiver where over the past 3 weeks, he has had 14 total targets. This has been a much better Panthers offense since you had Andy Dalton under center. Sportsbooks this week actually have this Panthers offense sitting with an implied team total of 19.5 points though. So it should be a lower scoring game and a tough matchup against Chicago. Going up against the Niners, Harrison will be much lower in these rankings this week than it will be in our rest of season ranks. Obviously, you can always go over to flockfantasy.com, pull up the average rest of season rankings for free. But specifically looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. for this week, it's a brutal matchup against a great Niners defense. The underdog pick'em on Harrison's only 54.5 receiving yards this week, which I actually don't mind going higher than 54.5 receiving yards. And obviously, if you wanted to tail us on that, you can find the link in the description and the comment section to Underdog Fantasy, where if you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you will get a free Dak Prescott pick, more than less than half a total yard for the game this Sunday night. And on top of that, you'll get a free team review in the live stream that we are doing every single night through flockfantasy.com. Now, going over to our next guy, we'll have Diontae Johnson. Diontae Johnson, 14 targets 2 weeks ago with Andy Dalton under center. This past week, 13 targets. Diontae Johnson, obviously a must-start player at this point. There would be a wider gap between Harrison and Diontae in my rest of season ranks, but I don't know. It's hard to fade Diontae this week with what he's done over the past 2. Devon Achane, obviously, people were threatening to unsubscribe to the channel after week 2, and we said he was a sell-high guy. He's been horrible over the past 2 weeks with no Tua, as you would expect. Garbage offense really impacts everybody. I don't care if they're a running back or a wide receiver. With that being said, Achane has had 4 targets a game over the past 2 weeks. He is that dynamic back where you could see a big play really break the slate regardless. So even though sportsbooks have moved down the Miami Dolphins implied team total to 17 points, where it opened up at 19.5 this week, obviously you got to be low on the Dolphins, but I do think Achane's still somebody you have to start. Stefon Diggs this season is sitting here averaging 15, 16 points per game, has been extremely consistent for fantasy purposes. But at the same time, a lot of this has come off of touchdown efficiency, not necessarily target volume, at least in the games that you had Tank Dell. Tank Dell coming back in, I am a little bit concerned about what you are going to have with Diggs seeing some natural regression if the touchdown's not there. Najee Harris obviously has been very bad all season. Najee Harris is averaging 10, 11 fantasy points per game, but I'm sorry. Najee Harris is a must-start running back against a banged-up Dallas Cowboys defensive line with no Jalen Warren and with Cordell Patterson banged up. You saw a season-high 69% of the snaps for Najee Harris this past week. You had a season-high 6 targets. So if the receiving usage is pretty much at an all-time high, especially if the Steelers could potentially lead this game and look to run the ball in the second half, I think you would regret it if you didn't start Najee. Travis Etienne will be our next back. Obviously, Etienne has been absolutely garbage. The saving grace you have for Travis Etienne is going up against the Indianapolis Colts. The Jacksonville Jaguars are finally projected out by sportsbooks to kind of have a good offense. They currently are projected out to have 24.5 points scored here, which actually is higher than what you have with offenses like the Chiefs this week, which is encouraging. Going over to Tyreek, still got to rank Tyreek Hill as a must-start player. I know people are going to hate me for this, but if you look at it, you have the big playability with Tyreek. Even if over the past 2 weeks, he is only averaging about 7.5 fantasy points per game with no Tua. We obviously know he's much worse with no Tua. He'd be number 1 overall in these ranks. I still think if you bench him and then you get the long receiving touchdown, it's going to be ugly. Here's where people are really, really going to hate us. Brandon Ayuk, you have to start. I know Brandon Ayuk is a wide receiver that has not had 10 fantasy points all year. I know Brandon Ayuk at the same time is a wide receiver that has only averaged 5 targets a game in games where Deebo Samuel's played. But you have the highest implied team total of any team in the NFL this week with the Niners. This should be arguably the highest scoring game in the NFL. Right now, if you look at underdog pick'ems, they have them higher, lower, 59.5 receiving yards. Obviously has not had 59.5 receiving yards all year. If you wanted to take the lower, you're more than welcome. The link's in the comment section, but I'd warn you against it because I do think you have the big playability with Ayuk. I do think it makes sense that he starts off slow when he wasn't at training camp all year. And this is the perfect matchup for a blow-up game for either Deebo or Ayuk. Obviously, Deebo's a must-start guy, much better than Ayuk at this point. Brian Robinson will be our next player we got to rank. I mean, if you look at Robinson, he's averaging 15, 16 fantasy points per game, which is great. But also with that being said, he misses practice on Wednesday and he misses practice on Thursday. So I am very concerned about his availability for Sunday. Obviously, we'll talk about Eckler later in the video. Terry McLaurin over the past 2 weeks has been phenomenal. Terry McLaurin over the past 2 weeks has dropped 38 total fantasy points, has scored a touchdown in both games. Jen Daniels has been the most efficient quarterback in the entire NFL. Terry McLaurin's been great. You have an applied team total of 23.5 points for this Washington Commanders offense. Garrett Wilson will be our next guy. Garrett Wilson has not been anything close to the wide receiver one you drafted him to be. Garrett Wilson right now is averaging about 11 fantasy points per contest. It has been disgusting. I know nobody likes it. Garrett Wilson's also 7th in the NFL in targets. It's a tough matchup going up against the Minnesota Vikings, so I'm not super excited to start him. I think you probably have to do it. In my rest of season rankings, he is a little bit higher than this because I do think you're going to have better matchups coming soon. DJ Moore will be our next guy. DJ Moore's had double-digit fantasy points every single game this year, but with that being said, the Keenan Allen addition actually lowers the target share for DJ Moore in this offense, where you actually only have 6 targets this past week for DJ Moore, which is a season low. Saves the day with the fantasy touchdown, but also has a season low in receptions, season low in receiving yards. Very worried about this being a low-volume passing attack where you have 3 guys seeing volume. DeAndre Swift will be my lineup this week. And Swift, if you do to me dirty again, I don't even know what I can possibly say here. I started Swift in week 1. I started Swift in week 3. We got 5 points, 6.2 points. Week 4, no way in hell he was in my lineup. I said never again. He scores 29.5. This matchup against the Carolina Panthers is about as good as you can possibly ask for. Carolina's at the top of the NFL in total points allowed to opposing running backs. We just saw both Zach Moss and Chase Brown dominate. Right now, you do have the Bears favored in this game. They have an implied team total of 23 points. So it should be a decent offense, and it's a great matchup. I'm starting him, but I'm terrified. Zach Moss will be our next guy. Zach Moss, back-to-back weeks, absolutely crushing it, but I am a little bit concerned that you did have the Chase Brown usage this past week. You actually see a season low 60% of the snaps for Zach Moss in Cincinnati. Going up against Baltimore, you'd assume that maybe this is a scenario where we get a ton of Joe Burrow dropbacks. This is a team that's not able to run the ball as they were against the Carolina Panthers. Jerome Ford, obviously, this ranking's under the assumption we have no Nick Chubb. Everything I read sounds like Chubb's not going to be back. Ford had 7 targets this past week going up against Washington. You actually have a much better implied team total for the Cleveland Browns than we've had in the past, where right now the Browns are projected out to score about 20 points in this game. And Ford did have 15.5 points last week in a full PPR format based off the cheap receptions. T. Higgins will be somebody I'm excited to start. T. Higgins had 10 targets last week. Seems like it's completely over the hamstring. It's a game going up against the Baltimore Ravens where you'd assume that you're actually going to be forced to throw the ball a bunch if you're going to try to keep up with Lamar. George Pickens will be our next receiver. Outside of week 2 in a really tough matchup against the Broncos, Pickens has been consistent with double-digit fantasy points every week. Obviously, you finally had the spike that you were looking for this past week, and what it took is it took the Pittsburgh Steelers to be trailing in a football game. It took the Steelers to be trailing to have to kind of open it up with Justin Fields and not necessarily lean so much on the run. Going up against Dallas, there isn't a chance that happens in this game. I'm going over to Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is at the very top of the NFL in targets. Amari Cooper so far this year is averaging 9.5 targets per game. And with that, you have one game with over 10 fantasy points. He gets the blow up against the Giants, but outside of that, it's some of the least efficient quarterback play we have seen in the entire NFL. And you sprinkle in the fact that Amari Cooper's dropping the ball as well. So I don't know. Based off quarterback efficiency, I'm concerned. Going over to Brian Thomas and Christian Kirk. Obviously, Brian Thomas has been so much better than this so far this season. And he's a rookie. We naturally assume that rookies are going to continue to get better as the year goes on. And you have a decent implied team total here for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I definitely think you can start Thomas and you can start Christian Kirk. My drawback with the two receivers is Evan Ingram coming back in here in Jacksonville. I'm a little bit concerned that Ingram will take some of these targets, particularly over the middle of the field, which I do think negatively impacts Kirk more than it does Thomas, which is why Thomas will be ranked ahead of Kirk this week. Kareem Hunt will be our next running back. Looking at Hunt, the running backs I'm expecting to be active in Kansas City will be Hunt, Steele, Pirine. Kareem Hunt last week did have 17 opportunities in a Patrick Mahomes offense that is willing to check the ball down to the running back position, and Kareem Hunt is a viable receiving back. So I'm okay starting Kareem Hunt. Am I excited to start Kareem Hunt? No, I am not. Our next guy, Trey Sermon. I'm okay to start Trey Sermon if you have no Jonathan Taylor. Am I excited to start him? No, I'm not. I mean, I would assume that Sermon pretty much sees every single touch here, but it's by no means is it a guarantee. Like, we have never seen Sermon be viable in fantasy at all. Going over to Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers, 21 targets through the first 2 weeks in games where the Ravens lose. The past 2 weeks, where they just boat race their opponents, Zay Flowers had 6 targets. Clearly, Flowers will be at the top of this team target share when Lamar is forced to drop back, when he is forced to air it out. Zay Flowers is going to have a very high percentage of this offense. When the Ravens win easily and they are able to establish the run, then it's going to be a much worse game environment. But against Cincy, you could very easily see this as a spot where Baltimore has to throw the ball. Rico Dowdle will be our next guy. I mean, with Rico Dowdle, I don't know if we can trust him. Yes, he had the season high 11 carries this past week. Yes, he is the starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys. Yes, Ezekiel Elliott has been completely phased out, but they're still using 3 running backs. It's a tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers. You have the floor with Dowdle. I think you actually have a higher ceiling with some players after him. Devin Singletary will be our next name. With Singletary, obviously this is a ranking under the assumption he does play. He's missed practice both on Wednesday and Thursday. But with Singletary already being kind of a limited option in terms of big play upside, touchdown upside in a bad offense, for us to play an injured Devin Singletary would probably be even worse. And then going over to Dontayvion Wicks. Dontayvion Wicks may skyrocket up these rankings. There's an outside chance that not only are you sitting here with no Christian Watson, but there's the outside chance that at the same time you have no Romeo Doubs. And if that does happen, Dontayvion Wicks and Jaden Reed will probably see the highest target share that they have ever had in fantasy football. It's a great offense and a great matchup against the Rams. Wicks had 13 targets last week. So obviously you can definitely get Wicks in, even if you just picked him up off the waiver wire. Dropping down to our next tier, we are going to be going with Chase Brown. Chase Brown sees a season high 15 rushing attempts this past week. And you have 3 targets. You have 18 total opportunities in what should be a very good offense. But also, if we take a step backwards, we can see that he had 14 carries through the first 3 weeks. So even though Chase Brown looked great and he was at a season high snap rate, season high carries, season high rushing yards, season high rushing touchdowns, it's tough to immediately trust Chase Brown. Xavier Worthy will be our next boom bust option, where if you are looking at Worthy here, obviously we get the massive receiving touchdown last week to get him there. While no, of course, he's not stepping into the Rashee Rice role. Of course, they are very different receivers. I wouldn't be surprised if you have no Rice. It means we get an extra target or 2 a game for Xavier Worthy. I'm going over to our next guy. We'll have Jackson Smith and Jigba. JSN, 3 straight weeks with over 80% of the snaps. We can see Shane Waldron was the problem. He's taking those problems to Chicago. JSN is fully good to go. This past week, 12 targets. 3 weeks ago, 16 targets. Obviously, you have a couple duds in there. This tier is the boom-bust tier, all right? This is the boom-bust tier, as you can tell. Ramondre Stevenson could be a boom in that he could be a starting running back this week in a game environment. You're playing the Dolphins. You're able to run the ball in the second half. He could be a bust in that Antonio Gibson could potentially be the starter because Ramondre has fumbled every single game this season. And I have no freaking idea. How am I supposed to know? Javonte Williams will be our next guy. Javonte Williams can be a bust because he's busted every single week so far this year. He could be a boom because this is finally a game where the Denver Broncos are favored. You had 19 opportunities last week. It's a great matchup going up against the Raiders. If you actually look at underdog pick'ems right now, they have them at 72.5 total yards, higher or lower. Austin Eckler will be so much higher in these rankings if you have no Brian Robinson. If you have no Brian Robinson, I would assume that Eckler has a pretty large red zone role. And at the same time, with no Brian Robinson, you're probably going to be in a spot where Eckler sees every single target in this backfield. He draws 4 to 5 targets, sees 10-ish carries. That's an environment where if you're in one of the best offenses in the league, which right now it looks like Washington is that, I think we're fine starting Eckler. Alexander Mattison will be our next name. I mean, kind of ambiguous spot where this is also a situation where Zamir White's missed practice the past 2 days. If you have no Zamir White, obviously Alexander Mattison moves up dramatically in these rankings. I'll be updating my rankings on flockfantasy.com pretty much every single day. Now, if Zamir White does play, am I excited to play a running back that may be the starter, but maybe in a committee in the worst offense in the NFL? Probably not. Jacoby Myers will be our next name. While, yes, Trey Tucker had all the points over the past week, Jacoby Myers over the past 2 weeks has had 19 targets. Am I super excited to start any Raider outside of Brock Bowers? No, I am not. You have an implied team total of 17 points this week. It does look like the Raiders are giving up, and it does look like sportsbooks are telling us they're going to be one of the worst offenses in the league. Obviously, very tough matchup against Denver. I'm going over to Jordan Addison. I am hoping and praying that Addison continues to come out and crush it for us. We get the 23 points this past week, but it was off of 4 targets. That's not something we can rely upon. We can't rely upon just 2 touchdowns randomly being there every week. So honestly, I'm viewing Addison kind of as a boom bust option in a tough matchup against the Jets. I'm going over to Tank Dell. Tank Dell had the target volume through the first 3 weeks in Houston. Obviously, he didn't really do anything with it, but I still stand by. I think it's a great Houston Texans offense, and I really hope Diggs keeps crushing Dell, but to be honest, if you look at the underlying volume that Dell had received through the first 3 weeks, I think Dell's a little bit closer to Diggs than Diggs is to Nico. And on top of this, Dell did practice Wednesday, Thursday, so it looks like he will be completely fine for the game. Xavier Legette, I have a ridiculous amount of Legette in underdog drafts. Please, Legette, crush for us. We got the receiving touchdown last week. He got the 10 targets as well. Going up against the Bears, it is a very tough matchup where you are seeing a lower implied team total for the Panthers this week than you had a week ago against Cincinnati, where right now the Panthers are only projecting out to score 19.5 points. Our next guy will be Rashid Shaheed. Shaheed had the best game in his NFL career last week if you were looking at target volume. We did this in the live stream the other night, but we went through and we looked at Shaheed every year in every game of his NFL career. And what you see is a lot of 4 targets, 5 targets, 6 targets, 4 targets, 5 targets, 6 targets, where if you get the receiving touchdown, it's phenomenal. If you get nothing, it literally can be a goose egg. Massive boom bust option. Really tough matchup against the Chiefs. Sportsbooks have an applied team total of 18.5 points here for this Saints offense. So it's a low scoring environment. While Shaheed did have the receiving volume this past week, that will be difficult to assume it's going to be the case every single week going into the future. But obviously, if you get another week of 11 targets, Shaheed flies up these rankings for week 6. Now, our next guy will be Wan'Dale Robinson. If you have no Malik Nabers, Wan'Dale Robinson flies up these rankings. He has averaged about 13 points per game so far in a full PPR format. Obviously, Wan'Dale is very dependent on 2 things. 1, is Malik Nabers playing in this game? If he isn't, Wan'Dale Robinson, you have to start. 2, is it a PPR format? If it isn't, you probably got to bench him because we don't have the big play upside. You just have the cheap target volume. Our next guy will be Jalen Waddle. I have Watt on the Flock League. I have Smith, Ladd, Laporte. I have a bunch of players on bye, so I am sadly having to start Jalen Waddle. It is brutal. Over the past, really all season, you've averaged 5 targets a game. Should be one of the least efficient passing offenses in the NFL. We have not cracked 10 fantasy points since week 1. Khalil Shakir will be our next guy. Shakir has missed practice over the past 2 weeks. If you have no Shakir, all of a sudden you're significantly more excited to get Keon Coleman in this game against Houston. Michael Pittman will be our next receiver. Obviously, this is a ranking under the assumption that Anthony Richardson is your starting quarterback. And if you look at the 3 games where Anthony Richardson has played 100% of the snaps, you had 4 receptions, 3 receptions, 4 receptions. In that environment, are we super pumped about Michael Pittman? No. Not a lot of passing volume. AR can steal the rushing touchdowns at the goal line, pretty much vulturing him from everybody in this offense, monopolizing the points for himself. If you have Flacco in here, Flacco's not running the ball. Flacco's going to air it out. And Pittman flies tears up these rankings. Cortland Sutton, 60 receiving yards last week. Bo Nix had 60 passing yards. Better matchup against the Raiders, but still, am I excited about it? Probably not. Zach Charbonnet, Braylon Allen, love these guys rest of season. Obviously, if you have an injury to Kenneth Walker, if you were to have an injury to Breece Hall, they immediately become top 10 options at their position. But honestly, they're probably just desperation plays if you really needed to get them in. You had 7 opportunities for Charbonnet last week, and you had 9 opportunities for Braylon Allen. Jerry Jeudy will be our next player. I think with Jeudy, I'm a little less excited if David Njoku does play. If David Njoku does play, I'd probably move him behind Rome Odunze. Rome had 3 targets last week. If we remove week 3, Rome's had 4 targets, 5 targets, 3 targets. So I still love Rome for the rest of season upside, but specifically as of now with how this offense projects out, it's very tough to start him. I think right now, Underdog has Rome higher, lower 32.5 receiving yards this week. Keenan Allen is a higher Underdog pick him. I think Keenan's like higher, lower 43.5 receiving yards this week. You actually had 11 targets for Keenan Allen week 1. Not going to lie to you, I completely forgot Keenan Allen even played week 1. Because with those 11 targets, he did nothing with them. He had 29 total receiving yards. And it's better than he had this past week. This past week, he had 19. And we'll have Josh Downs. Obviously, Josh Downs looks great with Joe Flacco under center. If Flacco is the quarterback here, we're significantly more excited about the receivers with Indianapolis, which we will fly them up our rankings. But obviously, we'll be updating these rankings on flockfantasy.com for y'all pretty much every single day with the most up-to-date injury news that we have. But I really do appreciate you and really hope I was able to help you out. And of course, if you want to say, Mason, you're an idiot, Ayuk shouldn't be this high, you can go take the lower on Ayuk receiving yards on Underdog Fantasy, lower than 59.5. I would warn against it, but regardless, I'm not you. And you can use promo code FLOCK if you are going to do that, because you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, on top of it, you will get a free Dak Prescott pick, more than less than half a total yard. And you'll get a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. Just make sure you set up an account on flockfantasy.com after you make that $10 deposit on Underdog Fantasy with code FLOCK, so I can hook you up with that free team review. But thank you again. Really appreciate you. Really hope I was able to help you out. I hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.